This is my first personal writing. It is an expository essay because my sixth graders actually had to write a compare and contrast essay this last quarter. And so what I wanted to be able to develop a model showing them how I compared two books that they may or may not have read and how I focused on some similarities and then focused on one main difference. And I chose these two books, A Tale Dark and Grim by Adam Gidwitz and Far, Far Away by Tom McNeill. They are both recent books that have come out. Far, Far Away was actually a Sunshine State Reader from this year. And these take kind of the fairy tale genre and make them very dark, very gruesome, and especially Adam Gidwitz at times very gory. And so these are kind of appealing to our young adult readers. This was a really helpful process because I was actually able to go through the entire process that they were, and in turn I revamped a lot of the things I did in my classroom. And so I was able to, brainstorm, come up with a better outline, show them how I developed a thesis statement, how then I used the thesis statement to outline my story, to fill in details. And in this, I actually did use text quotes, but I did not put in page numbers because I didn't require students to. Although in my final draft, they will have page numbers from the actual texts. And so here is a reading of my compare and contrast essay. Ever since Twilight hit the market in 2005, authors and producers have raced to get paranormal romances and darkened fairy tales on the market. Recently, this fan fiction trend has made its way into young adult literature, and books like A Tale Dark and Grim by Adam Gidwitz and Far, Far Away by Tom McNeill have hit the shelves. These books twist traditional tales, making the final products darker, more unsettling for the reader. Both Gidwitz and McNeill use similar writing techniques to engage the young reader and propel the action forward. A Tale Dark and Grim and Far, Far Away use strong narrators to emphasize the dark tones in both stories, but ultimately they lead the reader down two paths because the main characters deal with their respective conflicts differently. Both narrators intentionally reveal themselves to the reader on the first page, making it clear that the narrator is the one responsible for the reader's journey. In A Tale Dark and Grim, the author issues a warning to the reader through the narrator, telling the reader that the story is really dark and that frightening things happen. The narrator goes on to tell the reader in the introduction that the real Grimm tales are not boring fairy tales at all. Take Hansel and Gretel, for example. Two greedy little children try to eat a witch's house, so she decides to cook them and eat them instead, which is fair, it seems to me. But before she can follow through on her perfectly reasonable plan, they lock her in an oven and bake her to death. In Far, Far Away, the reader also meets Jacob, both the narrator and the ghost of Jacob Grimm. He begins his story with a warning to the reader. What follows is the strange and fateful tale of a boy, a girl, and a ghost. If more heavily seasoned with romance, this might have made a tender tale, but yet there was another player in the cast, the finder of occasions, someone who moved freely about the village, someone who watched and waited, someone with tendencies so tortured and malignant that I would scarcely bring myself to see them, and even now scarcely bring myself to reveal them to you. These purposeful introductions not only set up the narrator to drive the action in the stories, but it also alerts the reader to the dark and twisted nature of the tales. The dark, troubling tone is another similarity between these stories, where bad things continue to happen to the main characters. Unlike others, where the danger is brief and there are plausible escapes, these stories force the main characters to endure physical and emotional pain for the majority of the plot. In A Tale Dark and Grim, Hansel and Gretel have their heads cut off by their father, the king, and then come back to life only to battle a cannibalistic baker. Hansel is then killed by a huntsman with dogs, and Gretel has to boil an evil magician in a cauldron of oil. She later meets a beast boy who turns out to actually be Hansel. In Far, Far Away, Jeremy is tricked into captivity by the town baker, who turns out to be the evil and ominous finder of occasions. Jeremy is mentally tortured and physically starved or poisoned throughout the second half of the book. These stories both take readers down a long journey of sheer despair before finally resolving the major conflicts at the end. The most noticeable difference between the two stories is how the main characters struggle against their conflicts. A Tale Dark and Grim has many external, physical challenges that the main characters must blatantly fight through. However, both Hansel and Gretel are equipped with wit and strength, and the narrator uses humor to break up some of the darker scenes. Although Gretel must cut off her own finger to use as a key, the narrator immediately jumps in to apologize for the graphic details and lighten up the scene. In Far, Far Away, although the main character is being held against his will, Because there is so much mental torture between both Jacob and Jeremy, the heart of the main conflict is an internal one. Throughout Jeremy's captivity, his mental and physical health rapidly deteriorate, and the narrator feels that there will be no happily ever after to his friend. Throughout this conflict, there is no humor or hope for the reader, and at one point Jacob is actually convinced that the main character has died at the hands of the villain. Jeremy and Ginger lay with their arms extended through the bars intertwined. They were motionless. I swept in and searched frantically for the subtlest movement of faint breathing, but found none. Even though A Tale Dark and Grim is filled with far more violence and gore, it is not as sinister and mentally taxing as Far, Far Away. Although both stories end with the main characters battling obstacles, the reader is far more optimistic and hopeful in A Tale Dark and Grim than in Far, Far Away. In Far, Far Away, McNeill created a conflict that dragged his main characters down a dark path, and the reader could not help losing hope as the pages wore on. Gidwitz's narrator, characters, and actions helped A Tale Dark and Grim meet its really dark and frightening promises made in the introduction without a suffering tone.